The ranch was quiet that night, with only the crickets and the soft creak of the windmill echoing in the distance. Inside the grand, sprawling house, a young woman moved about quietly, her steps careful, her hands tired but steady. She was the maid, no one important in the eyes of the world, just someone hired to clean the messes, wash the dishes, and make sure the cowboy's little girl had someone to watch her when the day stretched too long. Her name was Clara, and though her life had never been easy, her heart had always been tender. The little girl, Lily, had trouble falling asleep most nights. She missed her mama, gone too soon, leaving an emptiness in her tiny chest that no toy or lullaby could easily fill. So Clara would sit by her bed, smoothing down the curls on her head, humming old songs she remembered from her childhood. They weren't fancy songs, just simple tunes her own mama used to sing when life was hard, songs that carried a warmth words alone couldn't hold. And tonight, as Lily's big eyes blinked sleepily in the dim lamplight, Clara's voice filled the room with a sweetness that seemed to chase away every shadow. The cowboy, James, had been gone for days, business trips, cattle deals, long nights under the stars with no one but his horse for company. He was a man who carried grief in silence, burying himself in work, hiding his brokenness behind the brim of his hat. He had loved once, deeply, and losing his wife had nearly broken him in two. His daughter was his whole world, but the truth was, he didn't know how to raise her alone. That was why Clara had been hired, to keep things running, to care for Lily, to fill the spaces he couldn't. When James pushed open the heavy oak door that night, the house was dark, save for the faint glow from his daughter's room. He expected silence, maybe the soft sound of her breathing, maybe the maid tidying up before slipping away. What he didn't expect was the sound of a voice, soft, rich, aching with emotion. He paused at the threshold, his boots rooted to the ground, as the melody wrapped around him like a blanket he didn't know he needed. Clara sat there, eyes closed, holding Lily's little hand as she sang. Her voice trembled at times, but there was strength in it too, strength born from knowing pain and still choosing to love anyway. James leaned against the doorway, his hat pressed to his chest, listening. He saw the way his daughter's breathing slowed, her lashes finally settling against her cheeks as she drifted into sleep. And he saw something else too, the way Clara's face softened, the way she poured every ounce of herself into comforting a child who wasn't even hers. For the first time in years, James felt something stir in him. He had thought his heart was buried, that no one could touch it again. But here was this young woman, with calloused hands and tired eyes, giving his little girl the one thing even money couldn't buy, tenderness. When the song ended, Clara leaned down and kissed Lily's forehead, whispering a prayer no one else could hear. As she stood and turned, her breath caught, because James was there, watching her. Her cheeks burned, and she fumbled with her apron, embarrassed to be caught in such a private moment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker," she whispered, her voice shaky. She couldn't sleep, and I thought maybe the singing would help. But James didn't scold her. He didn't remind her she was just the maid or that she was overstepping. Instead, he stepped into the room, his gaze soft in the lamplight. "You've got a gift," he said quietly, his deep voice roughened by emotion. "I ain't heard this house sound that alive in a long time." Clara looked at him, startled by the sincerity in his tone. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, not with awkwardness, but with something unspoken, something that hummed beneath the surface. From that night on, James found himself coming home earlier whenever he could. More often than not, he'd find Clara with Lily, sometimes singing, sometimes reading, sometimes laughing so freely that the sound spilled through the house like sunlight breaking through clouds. And each time, James felt the walls around his heart weakening. He began to notice things about Clara, the way her hair caught the firelight, the way her hands never hesitated to work, the way she always put others before herself. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't polished like the women he sometimes met in town, but she was real. She carried a quiet dignity, a strength carved out of hardship, and it drew him in more than he cared to admit. Clara, too, found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. She had thought him cold at first, a man too wrapped up in his sorrow to notice anything beyond his grief. But as the days turned into weeks, she caught glimpses of the man beneath, the father who knelt clumsily to braid his daughter's hair, the cowboy who played the fiddle softly when he thought no one was listening, the man whose eyes softened when Lily laughed. And she felt her heart slipping, even though she reminded herself she had no right. She was just the maid. But love doesn't ask permission. It blooms in silence, in stolen moments, in the spaces between words. And on a quiet night not so different from the first, James once again found himself standing in the doorway, watching Clara sing to his daughter. Only this time, when the song ended, he didn't stay silent. He crossed the room, placed his hat on the dresser, and said in a low voice that trembled with truth, "You've given us more than I ever asked for. And I can't pretend I don't see it anymore." Clara froze, her heart racing, as he looked at her with a tenderness she never thought she'd see in his eyes. And in that moment, the maid was no longer invisible. She was the woman who had brought warmth back into a cold house, the one who had healed a broken little girl, and unknowingly, a broken man too. And though the world might still call her just the maid, to James and Lily, she had become so much more. Clara's chest rose and fell too quickly, her hands trembling against the folds of her apron. The cowboy's words hung in the air like the last echo of a church bell after Sunday service, soft but impossible to ignore. She wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't heard, but his gaze pinned her to the spot. His eyes, deep and weary, held a rawness she hadn't seen before, not in all the months she'd worked under his roof. It wasn't the look of a man simply noticing someone. It was the look of a man who had been blind for too long and suddenly realized what stood in front of him. Her lips parted, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? That she'd sung not to impress him, but because Lily's small hand in hers reminded her of a time when she, too, needed someone to chase away the dark. That she hadn't meant to open her heart so wide, but somehow the little girl had slipped inside, and with her had come feelings she could no longer hide. James stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under his boots. He stopped only a few feet away, his broad shoulders tense as if he wrestled with something inside him. Clara could smell the faint scent of leather and dust on him, the smell of long days riding and working under the sun. For a moment, he was just a man, not the wealthy ranch owner, not the hardened cowboy the town whispered about, but a man who had lost, who had hurt, and who stood at the edge of something he wasn't sure he deserved. "Clara," he said, her name falling from his lips with surprising gentleness. "You've done more than watch over my girl. You've given this house life again. And me, I don't even know when it started, but I can't stop noticing the way you are with her. The way you care." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him not to say such things, that they would only bring trouble. A maid wasn't meant to catch the heart of her employer. The town would never let her forget her place, and neither would his family or his friends. But when she glanced toward Lily, sleeping peacefully with a small smile tugging at her lips, Clara knew the truth was already written. It wasn't about places or roles, it was about love. She lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to overstep. She needed comfort, and I gave what I could." James studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "And what you gave was more than I ever could on my own." The words struck deep. Clara felt warmth rush to her cheeks, but there was fear too. Love had never come easy to her. She had grown up with little, working since she was old enough to carry a bucket, moving from one household to another, always the help, never the one to be seen. Affection was something she gave freely but rarely received. To imagine that this man, this cowboy whose presence filled every room he entered, might feel something for her, it was almost too much to believe. Over the weeks that followed, James's quiet acknowledgement that night became something unspoken between them. He didn't push, didn't corner her with words or expectations. Instead, it showed in the way he lingered at supper when he used to eat in silence. It showed in the way he came home earlier, as though the draw of the ranch house was stronger than the call of cattle and land. It showed in the way his eyes softened whenever he saw her with Lily, laughing at something silly or patiently teaching the girl to thread a needle or braid her doll's hair. Clara tried to remain unchanged. She scrubbed the floors, folded the linens, polished the silver just as she always had. But she couldn't deny the shift in her heart. Every time James walked into the room, she felt it thud against her ribs, a reminder that she was treading ground she shouldn't. One evening, Lily tugged at her hand and whispered, "Miss Clara, do you think Daddy's happy now?" The question nearly undid her. She glanced at the little girl, whose big brown eyes searched hers with such hope. Clara swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "I think he's finding reasons to be," she replied softly. Lily grinned. I think you're one of the reasons. The innocence in her voice, the simplicity of her truth, broke something open inside Clara. She excused herself quickly, retreating to the quiet of the kitchen where she leaned against the counter, fighting tears. She had promised herself not to fall. She had promised to remain only what she was hired to be. But love had a way of seeping into the cracks, refusing to be swept aside. One stormy night, the ranch was battered by rain and thunder that shook the windows. Lily woke, frightened, and Clara rushed to her side. She climbed onto the bed, gathering the trembling child into her arms, humming softly until the storm outside seemed less frightening. When she finally looked up, James was standing in the doorway again, but this time there was no hesitation. He crossed the room in 3 strides and sat beside them, his large hand resting gently on his daughter's back. For the first time since Clara had known him, he let himself lean into the moment, allowing the closeness to wash over him. His eyes met Clara's over Lily's head, and in that silent exchange, something solidified. After Lily drifted back to sleep, James didn't leave. He stayed seated, his elbows resting on his knees, his hat dangling from his hand. The thunder rolled far away now, but the storm inside the room was just beginning. Clara, he said, his voice low, almost hesitant, I don't want you to think I'm blind to what people would say. You work here, and I know the difference in our lives. But I can't ignore what I feel anymore. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to tell him not to say it, that it would complicate everything. But she also knew there was no stopping truth once it rose to the surface. What do you feel? She asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, the weight of years of loneliness in his eyes. That this house hasn't felt like home since my wife passed. That my little girl hasn't smiled the way she does with you in longer than I care to admit. And that when I think about tomorrow, I can't picture it without you here. Not just as her caretaker. Not just as the maid. But as someone we both need. The silence after his confession stretched thin, every heartbeat loud in Clara's ears. Her hands twisted in her lap, her mind warring with itself. She had dreamed, in quiet moments, of being seen this way, but dreaming and living it were different things. Finally, she lifted her gaze, her eyes shining with tears. You don't know what you're saying, James. I'm not the kind of woman people expect for you. I don't have wealth, or status, or... He cut her off gently. I don't give a damn about what people expect. I care about what's real. And this, he gestured between them, his voice rough with emotion, is real. Her chest ached, torn between fear and longing. But as she looked at him, at the sincerity etched in every line of his face, she knew he wasn't a man to speak lightly. His words were truth, and though they terrified her, they also gave her something she'd never thought she'd have. A place where she was wanted, not for what she could do, but for who she was. The days that followed were a delicate dance. They didn't announce anything, didn't speak of it openly, but the air between them was charged. A brush of his hand against hers as they both reached for the coffee pot. A lingering glance across the table. A quiet moment on the porch after Lily had gone to bed, the night humming with crickets as they sat side by side in silence, words unnecessary. But the world has a way of noticing things it isn't meant to. The whispers began, first among the ranch hands, then in town. Questions about why the cowboy came home earlier than he used to, about why the maid seemed brighter, her laughter more frequent. Some called it scandalous, others merely curious, but the gossip swirled all the same. Clara heard it when she went to the market, felt the stares on her back as she walked. She tried to ignore it, but the weight pressed heavier each day. One evening, she found herself standing in the barn, the smell of hay and horses thick in the air, her heart heavy. When James found her there, her hands knotted together, he knew before she spoke. They're talking, she whispered, her voice breaking. They're saying things about me, about us. I can't be the reason your name gets dragged through the mud. James stepped closer, his hands firm as they rested on her shoulders. Let them talk. They don't live our lives. They don't know what's in my heart, or yours. And I won't let them take this from us. Her tears spilled then, not from weakness, but from the release of carrying too much alone. For the first time, she leaned into him fully, her forehead against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that felt unshakable. From that night on, Clara stopped fighting what was between them. She allowed herself to belong, to James, to Lily, to the life that was. Slowly, tenderly unfolding, she was no longer just the maid. She was the woman who sang away the night terrors, who brought laughter back to a broken house, who gave love where it was most desperately needed. And though the world might always have something to say, in that ranch house, with the cowboy's arms around her and his daughter's smile lighting her way, Clara found her place. Clara woke earlier than usual the next morning, though sleep had only come in fleeting scraps. Her mind had been a storm of thoughts all night, replaying James's words in the hush of the bedroom where Lily slept peacefully between them. She had crept back to her small quarters with her heart racing, trying to quiet the ache of hope inside her. The little room was simple, just a bed, a washstand, a wooden chest with her few belongings. She had always thought of it as a place she passed through, not somewhere she belonged. But that night, she had lain awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if belonging might finally be possible. When the sun spilled over the horizon, painting the ranch in hues of gold, she moved through her chores with hands steadier than she expected. Washing, sweeping, tending to the hens. Each task felt different now, colored by the memory of James's voice, the way his gaze had held hers without shame, without hesitation. Yet the weight of the town's whispers lingered like dust in the air. She heard them even when no one spoke, the harsh tones of disapproval, the hiss of judgment. She had lived long enough to know how cruel people could be when someone stepped out of the place they were assigned. James found her in the garden that evening, her skirts brushing against the dirt as she pulled weeds from between rows of beans. He crouched beside her without a word at first, his hands large and rough but gentle as he helped tug a stubborn root from the earth. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "Do you ever think about what people will say? About how it'll look?" James brushed soil from his hands, sitting back on his heels. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his voice carried steady. "Clara, I've lived too many years worrying about what folks think. They didn't carry me through the nights when grief nearly killed me. They didn't help me raise Lily when I had no idea how. They sure didn't put food on this table or keep this ranch alive. You did more for this home than anyone else could have. And if people can't see that, then let 'em choke on their own gossip." His bluntness startled her, but it also warned her. James wasn't a man who wasted words, and when he spoke, it came from a place deeper than pride. He wasn't just defending her, he was claiming her, even if the world wasn't ready for it. That night, after supper, Lily pulled at Clara's sleeve, her little eyes shining. "Miss Clara, will you sing for us in the parlor?" Clara hesitated, glancing at James. He leaned back in his chair, watching them both, and for the first time in a long while, there was no weariness in his gaze. Only quiet expectation. Clara nodded, her throat dry, and followed Lily into the parlor. She sat at the small upright piano tucked in the corner, its keys worn from years of use. Her fingers lingered above them before she began to play a tune she hadn't touched in years. Her voice rose, soft but sure, filling the room with a warmth that drew James to the doorway. He stood there, leaning against the frame, watching the two most important people in his life share a moment he never thought he'd see again. Lily twirled around the carpet in her nightgown, clapping along, her laughter spilling into the air like sunlight. Clara's song wrapped around them both, and James felt something stir so deep he couldn't name it. For the first time since his wife's passing, his house wasn't just a place to sleep. It was alive. Days bled into weeks, and the rhythm of life on the ranch shifted. Clara was no longer just the background figure, her presence overlooked. She became part of every corner, teaching Lily to bake biscuits, standing at James's side that needed to be made, livestock that needed to be bought, trips he had to plan. He spoke to her as if her voice mattered, as if her thoughts carried weight. But Clara couldn't silence the voice inside her that reminded her she was stepping into dangerous territory. She had seen how quickly fortune could change. One word from James to dismiss her, and she'd be gone, with nothing but her suitcase and the memory of belonging she'd once tasted. The fear clung to her, but so did the hope. One afternoon, when the heat pressed down heavy on the land, Clara sat on the porch shelling peas while Lily played with a rag doll nearby. James returned from town, dust clinging to his boots, his hat pushed low. He greeted his daughter with a kiss on the top of her head, then sat beside Clara. For a long moment, he simply watched her hands work. "They'll never stop talking," he said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of what she hadn't dared admit. Clara's hands stilled. She looked at him, searching his face. I know. But I don't care. He leaned closer, his tone firm. I've wasted too many years living with ghosts, Clara. I'm done letting other people write my story. I want you in it. Not in the shadows. Not hidden away. Right beside me. Her breath caught, the peas slipping from her fingers into the bowl. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let those words take root in her heart, but fear still clung. James, I'm just. He cut her off, his hand covering hers. Don't you dare call yourself, just, anything. You're the woman who gave my daughter her smile back. You're the reason I walk through that door and don't feel like I'm drowning anymore. You're not, just, the maid. You're everything I didn't know I needed. The truth of it silenced her. Tears blurred her vision, and before she could think better of it, she leaned into him. His arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close, and for the first time, she allowed herself to rest there, safe and unashamed. Lily looked up and grinned, her little hands clapping. See, Daddy, she said, her voice sweet as honey. I told you Miss Clara makes us happy. James chuckled, his chest rumbling against Clara's cheek, but his eyes shone with something deeper. Out of the mouths of babes, he murmured. In that moment, Clara realized the truth wasn't in what the town whispered or what society expected. It was in the little girl's laughter, in the strength of the cowboy's arm around her, in the way her heart finally felt at home. Whatever storms might come, whatever words might be thrown their way, they had already built something no one could take from them. And as the sun dipped low, casting its golden light across the ranch, Clara allowed herself to believe.
С годами связь Артема с лесом становилась все крепче. Мать наблюдала за ним и понимала, он не такой, как другие дети. Его глаза умели видеть то, что оставалось скрытым для остальных, его слух улавливал малейший шорох, а сердце будто билось в такт дыханию самой природы. В школе над ним иногда смеялись, говоря, что он странный, что он живет среди зверей, но он никогда не обижался. Он возвращался домой, уходил в лес и там чувствовал себя самим собой. Когда ему исполнилось 15, он уже мог уходить в чащу на несколько дней. Мать сначала пыталась запрещать, плакала, просила не рисковать, но потом смирилась. Она знала, в этих походах его оберегает нечто большее, чем человеческая забота. Иногда он возвращался с легкими царапинами, иногда уставший, но в его глазах всегда горел свет. И каждый раз, когда она спрашивала, что он делал там, он отвечал, она учила меня. Мать не понимала, как зверь может учить человека, но Артем говорил об этом так спокойно, будто это было самое естественное. Она показывает, где можно найти воду, как слушать землю, как чувствовать, когда рядом опасность. Она учит меня молчать и слышать. Эти слова звучали таинственно, но женщина понимала, ее сын становится другим. Он был не просто ребенком, спасенным когда-то чудом, он был связан с этим чудом неразрывно. Однажды вечером, когда гроза обрушилась на город, Артем вернулся мокрый до нитки. Его глаза светились так, как она не видела никогда. «Мама, я видел ее детей», — сказал он. Женщина остолбенела. «Каких детей?» — ее волчат. «У нее 3. Она показала мне их. Она доверяет мне». В голосе сына звучала гордость и трепет. Мать не знала, что ответить. Она понимала, что связь между ним и волчицей стала глубже, чем она могла представить. Прошло еще несколько лет. Артем стал юношей. Его плечи окрепли, взгляд стал серьезнее. Он уже не был ребенком, нуждающимся в защите. Но в глубине души он оставался тем самым младенцем, которого когда-то спасла волчица. И, казалось, он чувствовал долг перед ней. В один из вечеров он сказал матери: «Мама, когда она уйдет, я должен буду занять ее место». Женщина вздрогнула. «Что ты имеешь в виду? Она не вечна. Но лес всегда нуждается в том, кто будет его хранить. Она готовит меня к этому». Слова сына пугали ее. Она боялась потерять его, боялась, что однажды он уйдет в лес и не вернется. Но внутри знала, он прав. Все, что происходило с ним, вела какая-то сила, которую нельзя остановить. Тем временем в городе снова начались тревожные разговоры. В лесу стало пропадать больше скота, и люди снова обвиняли волчицу. Они забыли, что она защищала их, что спасла мальчика. Для них она была всего лишь зверем. И однажды группа мужчин с ружьями отправилась в лес, решив покончить с угрозой раз и навсегда. Артем узнал об этом случайно, подслушав разговоры. Его сердце сжалось. Он бросился в лес, не думая о последствиях. Чем глубже он бежал, тем сильнее ощущал ее присутствие. Он слышал в голове ее дыхание, видел образы, ее глаза, ее лапы, ее силуэт среди деревьев. И наконец он нашел ее. Она стояла на поляне, раненая, с окровавленным боком. Рядом суетились трое волчат, пищали, пытаясь спрятаться под ее брюхо. Артем бросился к ней, слезы хлынули из глаз. Нет, нет, он увидел стрелу в ее боку и понял, охотники были здесь. Волчица подняла голову. Ее глаза смотрели прямо в его душу. Она не рычала, не отталкивала его. Напротив, она позволила прикоснуться, и Артем впервые ощутил ее тепло не через сон или расстояние, а прямо в своих руках. Он вытащил стрелу, пытаясь остановить кровь, но знал, это бесполезно. Волчица тяжело дышала, ее тело дрожало. Охотники появились через несколько минут. Они увидели Артема, склонившегося над зверем, и замерли. Один из них поднял ружье, но мальчик встал перед волчицей, раскинув руки. «Не трогайте ее!» – закричал он. В его голосе звучала такая сила, что мужчины остановились. «Она не враг. Она спасла меня. Она защищала нас. Вы слепы, если не видите». Люди переглянулись, кто-то опустил ружье, кто-то все еще сомневался. В этот момент волчица издала слабый вой. Он был похож на прощание. Ее взгляд был устремлен на Артема, и он понял, она доверяет ему самое дорогое, своих детей. Она положила морду на землю, глаза ее медленно закрылись. Лес наполнился тишиной. Артем стоял неподвижно, пока ее дыхание не затихло окончательно. Слезы залили его лицо. Волчата прижались к нему, пищали, будто понимая, что их мать ушла. Охотники стояли молча. Никто не решался нарушить этот миг. В конце концов они развернулись и ушли, так и не решившись добить ее или тронуть волчат. С этого дня жизнь Артема изменилась окончательно. Он взял на себя заботу о 3 маленьких волчатах. Сначала он прятал их, носил еду, которую удавалось добыть. Мать помогала ему, хоть и боялась, что соседи узнают. Но она видела, что для ее сына это не просто животные. Это было наследие, которое передала ему волчица. Волчата росли быстро. Артем учил их, как охотиться, как прятаться. Он проводил с ними все больше времени, а в деревне все чаще шептались, что мальчик стал диким. Но ему было все равно. Он чувствовал, его место здесь, рядом с ними. Прошли годы. Артем стал взрослым мужчиной. Его мать состарилась, но в ее глазах все еще светилась гордость. Она понимала, что ее сын выбрал путь, который мало кто мог понять. Он не стал обычным человеком, живущим в городе. Он стал частью леса, его голосом и защитником. Люди начали замечать, что после смерти волчицы хищники перестали нападать на деревни. Казалось, лес сам успокоился, потому что у него появился новый хранитель. Артем все чаще уходил в чащу и проводил там недели. Волчата, ставшие сильными и могучими, сопровождали его. Они были его семьей. Иногда он возвращался домой к матери, приносил ей дрова, помогал по хозяйству, но всегда уходил обратно. И каждый раз она смотрела ему вслед и понимала, ее сын принадлежит не только ей, он принадлежит лесу. Однажды, когда ей снился сон, она увидела волчицу. Та стояла на поляне и смотрела прямо в глаза. «Я вернула его тебе, но теперь он мой», — словно сказала она. Женщина проснулась в слезах, но не от страха. Она знала, ее сын нашел свое предназначение. Со временем о нем начали ходить легенды. Люди говорили, что в лесу появился человек-волк, хранитель, который не дает злу проникнуть в деревню. Одни утверждали, что видели, как он ходит рядом с огромными серыми зверями. Другие говорили, что слышали его вой в полнолуние. Никто не знал правды, кроме матери. Для нее он навсегда оставался тем самым мальчиком, которого однажды спасла волчица. Но теперь он был и ее продолжением. Его глаза горели тем же светом, что когда-то сверкал в темноте леса взгляд волчицы.